My name is Chung Ui. I am 68 years old, a Chinese-American woman who has lived most of her life in a small house filled with the smell of rice and steam from long days of work. I came to this country from Guangdong when I was 19, carrying nothing but a small suitcase, a jade pendant pressed into my palm by my mother, and the hope that one day my children would not have to scrub their hands raw as I had seen her do. I never became rich, but I became steady. For 40 years I worked in a laundromat, the heat of the presses making my skin ache, the soap searing the lines of my hands, yet I never complained because all that labor was for my only son, Wei. He was the light I held onto in the darkest nights, the one whose name gave me strength when exhaustion whispered that I could not keep going. When he was little, I taught him his first characters at our kitchen table, showed him how to say thank you in 2 languages, and packed steamed buns in his lunchbox even when other children teased. I watched him grow from a quiet boy clutching my leg to a man in a suit with polished shoes, and at every step I told myself that my sacrifices were worth it. Now Wei is 38, married to Lena, and I find that the life I gave to him has left me with little more than silence. Holidays are spent with Lena's family, birthdays celebrated in their bright suburban home, photographs taken with them smiling around the table while I sit in my house alone. When I call, it is Lena who answers, her voice polite but cold, telling me they are busy, that maybe next week will be better. Wei's voice in the background grows fainter with every season, like a song I used to know but can no longer hear. I try to remind myself that children must grow and make their own families, but there are nights when I stare at the empty chair across my table and wonder if I raised my son, only to lose him. The years I bent my back in steam and soap now echo through the rooms of a house filled with photographs of a boy who once needed me, and the bitter truth that now he has chosen another family over his own mother. It did not happen all at once. The divide came slowly, like a shadow creeping over the walls of my life, until I realized I was sitting in the dark. At first it was small things. Holidays that used to be mine suddenly moved to Lena's parents' house, where they cooked dishes I did not recognize and played games I did not understand, and I was told it was easier that way because everyone was already gathered there. My dumplings and fish, the foods I had prepared for Wei since he was a boy, were dismissed as too heavy or too old-fashioned, and Lena laughed gently as she said her family liked lighter meals, as though my recipes were burdens instead of gifts. I tried to hold on. I tried to invite them to my house, to set the table with red cloth and bowls of steaming rice, but excuses always arrived before they did, and I would pack the leftovers into containers and freeze them. A mother cooking for ghosts. Wei sat quietly through it all, nodding along with Lena, and I could see in his eyes the same boy who once begged for my noodles now swallowed his words, because it was easier to please his wife's family than to defend mine. At Lena's parents' home, I was offered a chair in the corner, polite smiles that never reached their eyes, and conversations carried on in front of me, as though I were invisible. They spoke of vacations, of business ventures, of plans for the granddaughter, and when I tried to share stories from my past, about Guangdong, about the struggles of making a life here, the silence that followed was heavier than any insult, until one of them would change the subject as though I had not spoken at all. I began to understand that I was no longer part of the circle, that my place had been quietly taken, and my son had allowed it, because it was easier than fighting. The festivals I once hosted, where I lit lanterns and taught Wei the stories of ancestors, were replaced by gatherings where my traditions were called quaint, nice for history books but not for living rooms. I felt myself shrinking, becoming a guest in my own bloodline, a relic to be tolerated. In those moments I understood loneliness in a way I had never known before. Spent the entire day preparing that dinner, rising early to knead dough for dumplings, the way my mother had once shown me. my hands remembering every fold and press, as if they had carried that knowledge from another lifetime. And I simmered pork bones until the broth filled the house with the deep, comforting smell that always made Wei come running as a child, clutching his bowl with eager hands. I laid out fish steamed with ginger and scallions, sticky rice wrapped in lotus leaves, and sweet red bean buns, because Wei used to smile with sugar dust on his cheeks, and for a moment I let myself believe that perhaps tonight would be different, that he would sit across from me with Lena and our granddaughter, and my table would not echo with silence. I set the table with care, placing chopsticks neatly, pouring tea into cups before they arrived so everything would be warm, and I sat in my best blouse, smoothing the wrinkles from the fabric as I watched the clock creep past 6, then 7. At last the phone rang, and when I answered, it was Lena, her voice light and practiced, telling me they would not be coming after all, because her parents had decided to host a gathering at the last minute, and it was easier for them to go there since they were already nearby. She apologized with words that sounded like courtesy, but not regret. And before I could respond, the line clicked dead. I stood there holding the receiver, the sound of the dial tone filling the room, and when I turned back to the table, the steam from the dishes had already begun to fade, curling into the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. I sat down at the head of the table anyway, staring at the 4 empty chairs, and I forced myself to take a bite of each dish, tasting flavors that once carried joy, but now only deepened the ache inside my chest. I thought of Wei as a boy, tugging at my sleeve, begging me to tell stories about our ancestors while he slurped noodles. And I wondered when that boy had vanished, replaced by a man who chose another family's table over his own mother's table. By the time I put the food away, sealing containers that would only remind me of what had been lost, I realized it was not hunger I feared, but the silence, a silence that had become the loudest sound in my life. When my granddaughter was born, I thought I would finally have a second chance at love, that I could hold her in my arms and pass down the lullabies my mother once sang to me in a dialect that Wei never fully learned, but always listened to with wide eyes. And I imagined weekends where she would sit on my lap as I taught her how to fold dumplings or plant spring onions in the garden. Little traditions that could root her to where she came from. Instead, I watch from the margins as Lena's parents, who live just minutes away from Wei's home, become the ones who pick her up from school, take her to the park, and are spoken of as the real caregivers. I hear about their outings only through pictures on social media, where my granddaughter beams in matching outfits with Lena's mother, and I am left staring at the screen with an ache so sharp it feels like the ground has opened beneath me. When I ask Wei if I might take her for a weekend, or even an afternoon, he says it would be complicated, that Lena's parents already have everything arranged, and Lena herself reminds me gently that the child is already comfortable with their routine, as though my love would disrupt the fragile balance of her world. I have a drawer in my kitchen filled with coloring books, hair ribbons, and small toys I have bought in secret, waiting for the day she might spend even a few hours with me. Yet that drawer remains untouched, a shrine to a role I have been denied. Sometimes, when I see other grandmothers in the market guiding little hands across busy streets, I feel the sting of envy, as if my place has been stolen and repainted in brighter colors to fit another family's story. I think back to the years I gave Wei everything I had, how I walked home with sore feet so that he could have new shoes, and I cannot understand how he does not see the cruelty of allowing me to stand outside the window of my own bloodline. To them, I am a distant figure, a polite smile at the occasional dinner, a name scribbled on a holiday card, but not the woman who rocked Wei through fevers or whispered courage into his ears when the world mocked his accent. In their eyes, I am unnecessary, erased, a grandmother only in name. When Wei arrived at my door one Saturday morning without calling first, my heart leapt as if I had been given back something precious I thought was lost. And for a brief moment I let myself imagine he had come simply to see me, to sit at my table and share tea, the way we once did when he was young and his whole world fit inside the walls of this house. He hugged me quickly, distracted, and I noticed how his eyes travelled around the room. Not with nostalgia, but calculation. And even before he spoke, I felt the air shift, the warmth of his presence thinning like steam from a kettle left too long. He sat on the sofa where he once built forts out of cushions, and his voice was cautious as he said that he and Lena were struggling, that their mortgage had become too heavy, that Lena's parents thought it would make sense for them to move into my home since it was larger and already paid off. I listened without interrupting, my fingers tracing the handle of my cup, and I realized he was not here for me at all, but for this house, for the roof I had sweated over, and the walls I had painted with hands that never rested. He spoke of practicality, of how it would be better for the granddaughter, of how I would never have to worry about being alone again. But his words carried the hollow sound of rehearsed lines, and in them I heard Lena's voice more than his. It was as if my son had been sent as a messenger, carrying not love, but a request disguised as duty. And I felt the weight of it press against me, harder than the years ever had. I looked at him and wondered if he remembered the nights I sewed his clothes by the light of a single bulb, if he remembered how I carried laundry baskets heavier than my own body, just so he could sit in a warm classroom, and yet here he was speaking not of gratitude but of convenience. When he left, he kissed my cheek lightly, already looking toward his car, and I stood at the doorway watching him disappear, feeling the bitter clarity settle inside me, that his sudden visit was not about his mother at all, but about her house. And that was the day my heart understood the difference between being loved and being useful. That night, after Wei left, I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at the cup of tea that had long gone cold, and the silence pressed down on me so heavily it felt as though the walls themselves were conspiring to remind me how empty my life had become. I thought of all the years I had bent my back and bruised my hands for him, how I had endured aching feet and burning lungs in the laundromat, how I had gone without so he could have new books, new shoes, a chance to stand taller than I ever could, and yet here I was, treated not as a mother to be cherished, but as an obstacle to be managed. Grief welled up inside me, not the grief of death, but the grief of betrayal, sharp and unrelenting, a grief that whispered, I had lost my son, even though he still lived. Humiliation burned in my chest as I remembered Lena's careful, polite smile, the way her parents looked at me as though I was small and outdated. And I wondered when I had become someone dismissed so easily, when my sacrifices had been reduced to little more than dust swept under their rug. I thought of my own mother, her face lined by hardship, how she pressed that jade pendant into my hand when I left Guangdong, telling me to endure because endurance was the thread that kept our family from unraveling. She carried silence like armor, never complaining, never breaking, and I used to admire her for it. But as I sat there that night, I wondered if perhaps silence was not always strength, but sometimes a wound that passes itself from one generation to the next, teaching children to endure rather than to demand love. Was I repeating her fate, bearing the weight of giving everything only to be forgotten in the end? I touched the pendant still hanging at my neck and felt the ache of that question tighten my chest. I had believed suffering was a price paid once, so that the next life, the child's life, could be lighter, freer. But perhaps suffering does not end. Perhaps it clings like smoke and drifts from mother to child, reshaping itself into new forms, a cycle that refuses to break. The silence in that room told me what I did not want to hear. that I was carrying not only my grief but hers as well. I made a choice in those days, when anger threatened to spill out of me and drown every word that left my mouth. And instead of raising my voice or demanding answers, I folded myself into silence, the same silence my mother once used when storms passed through her life. And I began to simply watch. I told myself that truth always reveals itself if one is patient. And so I became a witness in my own home, seeing more clearly than those who believed they had already claimed it. Lena would walk through my rooms with the assuredness of someone already holding a deed in her hands, running her fingers along the walls as though measuring their worth, her voice bright and careless as she spoke about tearing down one partition to make the kitchen larger, or repainting the bedrooms in softer colors. I stood behind her quietly, listening to her laugh about how easy it would be to modernize the space. And each word fell on me, like cold rain, soaking me with the realization that, in her mind, this house was no longer mine, but theirs. Wei trailed after her, sometimes nodding, sometimes silent, but never once stopping her, never once reminding her that this home had been bought with the skin of my hands and the ache of my bones, never once acknowledging that the walls she wanted to change had heard his cries as a baby and his laughter as a boy. He watched her sketch invisible lines in the air, her hands mapping out renovations like a general planning conquest, and he smiled in that small, weary way that told me he had surrendered to her vision long before I even knew a battle had begun. In those moments I felt invisible, a ghost wandering corridors I had built, and yet I refused to let their blindness turn me into what they believed me to be. My silence became my weapon, my observation, my shield, and while they thought me passive, shrinking, I was taking in every detail, every careless word, every gesture of entitlement. I learned the shape of their ambition and the depth of their disregard, and I carried those truths inside me, like stones placed carefully, one by one, heavy but deliberate, waiting for the day when they would form a foundation strong enough to hold me steady against them. I knew I could not keep living with the dread that at any moment the house I had built with my life would be claimed as someone else's prize. So one quiet morning, I took the bus across town and walked into the office of my old friend, Mr. Alvarez, a lawyer whose children once played with Wei when they were small. He greeted me with the warmth of someone who still remembered me as more than a shadow at family gatherings. And when I told him my fears, how Wei and Lena spoke of my home as if it were already theirs, his eyes softened with understanding, but his words carried the firmness of law. He explained that love cannot be forced, but property can be protected, and together we drafted a living trust. A document that placed every nail, every tile, every wall of this house under my name alone, sealed beyond contest, safe from any greedy hands. As I held the pen and signed my name, the same name I had once carefully written on job applications with trembling hope, I felt a strength return to me that I thought had been lost, the strength of a woman who had built something real with nothing but endurance and faith. The trust would ensure that no matter how hard Wei or Lena pressed, no matter what stories they told about duty or family obligation, the house would remain mine until the day I chose to pass it on, and even then it would bypass them and go where my heart directed, perhaps to my granddaughter, perhaps to a cause that would outlive us all. When the papers were tucked into a folder and placed in my bag, I felt as though I carried a hidden weapon, invisible yet unbreakable, a shield forged not from anger but from wisdom. I left the office with my back straighter, my steps firmer, knowing that for the first time in many years, I had taken control of something, instead of waiting to be erased. They would look at me and still see a quiet, compliant woman, someone too old to resist. But inside I was steel, wrapped in silence, prepared for whatever storm would come. The house was no longer just bricks and wood. It was my fortress, my proof that I had not lived in vain, and I swore to myself I would never let anyone take it from me. On the morning of my 69th birthday, I woke with the quiet hope that perhaps Wei would remember, that perhaps the phone would ring with his voice carrying even the smallest trace of the boy who once ran into my arms with drawings he made just for me. But the hours crept by, and the silence only thickened, broken only by the whistle of the kettle and the ticking of the clock that seemed to mock my waiting. I set out a small cake I had bought for myself from the bakery, a single candle ready, because I told myself it is better to be prepared for joy, even if it does not come. Yet the candle remained unlit, and the cake sat untouched, its frosting beginning to harden at the edges, as dusk fell without a word from my son. The next afternoon, the doorbell rang, and for a fleeting instant, my heart surged, thinking perhaps he had remembered too late, that he had come to make amends with flowers or even just a hug. But when I opened the door, Wei stood there with Lena, their faces brisk with purpose, not tenderness. They did not mention my birthday at all, did not notice the wilted candle on the counter, or the small cake still in its box. Instead, Lena's eyes scanned the house with that same gleam of ownership I had seen before, and her words were sharp though dressed in politeness as she pressed again the idea of moving in, of how it would be easier for everyone, of how this space could be made more useful if they took charge of it. Wei nodded in agreement, his voice low but firm, and I sat there listening, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the echo of the forgotten day rise in me like a tide I dared not let spill over. Their visit was not a celebration of my life but a negotiation for my home, and the cruelty of it cut deeper than if they had not come at all. I studied Wei's face, searching for even a flicker of guilt or remembrance, but all I saw was resignation. A man who had chosen comfort over loyalty. Lena smiled as she spoke of renovations and brighter paint, as though erasing me from these walls was a favor she was offering. I remained quiet, holding my silence like armor, but inside, I felt the sharp fracture of knowing my son had forgotten me on the day I was born, yet remembered my house all too well. Wei's voice was sharper than I had ever heard it, when he finally said I was being selfish, the word falling from his lips like a stone thrown at glass, shattering something inside me I did not know could still break. He sat across from me at my own table, the same table where I once fed him bowls of congee when he was sick, where I patched the knees of his trousers while he did homework, and now he leaned forward, his eyes hard, telling me that a good mother would want to make life easier for her son, that holding on to the house was nothing but stubborn pride. Lena sat beside him, her tone smooth but cutting, speaking of family duty and respect, twisting those words into weapons that left bruises without ever touching me. She said I should be grateful they were willing to live with me, as if their presence would be a gift, as if I were a burden who could be redeemed only by surrendering the walls I had built with every sacrifice of my life. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded tightly together beneath the table, where they could not see them tremble, and I felt the silence rise between us like a wall thicker than any made of brick. I wanted to tell Wei that I had given up my youth for him, that my body had carried scars of labor he never knew, that every dream I once held for myself had been folded away so his could stretch wide, but I knew the words would only scatter like rice thrown into the wind, falling without weight. So I swallowed them, keeping my face calm, though inside I felt the grief of a mother watching her son turn away from her, not out of necessity, but out of choice. When they left, their voices still echoing in the hall, I went to my bedroom, pulled out the old leather-bound journal where I had written the milestones of Wei's life, and on a blank page I wrote not of birthdays or first steps, but of a vow. I promised myself that I would not give away the one thing that was truly mine. The house that had been bought with blood and endurance. that I would not let their demands erase my life's labor. The ink bled slightly on the page as my hand shook, but the vow was steady, and in that quiet moment, I claimed my strength again. I was in the middle of folding laundry when the doorbell rang, and before I could even smooth the wrinkles from my hands, Lena stood there, with her parents behind her, their faces bright with curiosity, as though they had been invited to a showing rather than arriving at the home of a woman who had never asked them in. They walked through the doorway without hesitation, their eyes already scanning the rooms, and Lena spoke quickly, her voice filled with the eager certainty of someone who believed the future had already been signed and delivered. She gestured toward the walls, suggesting how they could be knocked down to create a larger dining area, how the floors might be refinished for a more modern shine, how the kitchen could be fitted with new counters and brighter lights. Her mother added that the backyard would be perfect for summer gatherings, her father noting how the garage could be converted into a play space for the granddaughter. Each word spoken with the casual tone of ownership, as if the house had already changed hands while I stood quietly at its center. I poured tea into cups with steady hands, forcing myself into the role of polite hostess, offering them biscuits, as though their visit were nothing more than neighborly courtesy, and I nodded when Lena explained her vision, though inside I felt the slow, steady burn of defiance. They did not know, could not know, that the trust had already locked every inch of this place in my name, that their imagined renovations were nothing more than sketches drawn in the air. As they wandered from room to room, opening doors and peering into spaces that held my memories, I smiled faintly, keeping my silence like a veil, and in that silence, I found a strange kind of triumph. Let them dream of paint colors and new layouts. Let them measure with their eyes what they believed would soon belong to them. Because beneath their words, I carried the secret of certainty, the knowledge that none of their plans could touch what I had secured. When they finally left, thanking me with rehearsed politeness, I closed the door softly and leaned against it, listening to the fading sound of their voices. For the first time in a long while, I felt not erased but strong, the house around me humming like a fortress, and I whispered to myself that no one could take it from me now. It was a Sunday afternoon when the storm finally broke, the kind that does not announce itself with thunder outside, but with raised voices inside walls that had once only known the laughter of a boy and the quiet endurance of his mother. Wei stood in my living room, his face flushed with anger, and for the first time in his life, he shouted at me, his words sharp enough to slice through years of memory. He said that as my only child, he had a right to this house, that I was being unfair, that by refusing to hand it over, I was betraying him, the very son I had spent my life protecting. The word right echoed in my ears, hollow and cruel, because to me, rights are earned by love, not demanded by entitlement. I looked at him and saw not the boy who once tugged at my sleeve to show me his school drawings, but a man who had been taught to believe that inheritance replaced respect, that bloodlines excused greed. Lena stood beside him, her arms crossed, her mouth tight with satisfaction, and she spoke of duty, of how families in her world always supported their children, as if I had not already given every ounce of myself for him. Her words were dipped in judgment, painting me as a miser, hoarding what should be theirs, and I felt the humiliation crawl over me like heat rising from asphalt. For a moment I wanted to scream, to remind Wei of every sacrifice etched into my skin. But I knew rage would only feed their certainty, so instead I spoke softly, my voice steady like a thread pulled taut, and I told him that respect is not inherited, it is earned, and that nothing in this world, not even the bond between mother and son, can survive without it. My words settled heavily in the room, and I saw a flicker in his eyes, a momentary recognition quickly swallowed by Lena's hand pulling at his arm. She could not bear my refusal, And with a sharp breath, she turned, storming toward the door, her heels striking the floor like hammers. Wei followed her, his shoulders slumped, his gaze averted, and together they left, the door closing behind them with a finality that shook the silence afterward. I stood alone, my chest aching, yet somewhere inside me a small ember of strength glowed, for I had spoken truth without bending, and for the first time, I felt its power. It was weeks before I saw Wei again. Weeks where the silence between us grew heavier than stone, and when he finally appeared at my door without Lena beside him, I felt both relief and dread, as though I were standing on the edge of a river, unsure if it would carry me or drown me. He looked older somehow, his face drawn tight, his shoulders hunched as though he carried a burden he could not name, and for a moment I thought he might have come to ask forgiveness, to sit with me over tea, and remember that I was not just a gatekeeper to a house, but his mother. Instead, he stood awkwardly in the doorway, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and I could feel the tension in the air, a rope pulled taut between us. I did not ask questions, did not press him with accusations, because I knew words would only spiral into arguments that left both of us wounded, and I had already chosen silence as my armor. Without speaking, I walked to the cabinet, where I had hidden the folder from Mr. Alvarez, the one that contained the sealed letter spelling out the truth that the house was locked beyond reach, secured in trust to pass one day, not to him or to Lena, but to my granddaughter, who had done nothing yet but live with the innocence of a child. I placed the letter on the table between us, my hand lingering on it for a moment before sliding it toward him. And I told him quietly to read when he was ready, that everything he needed to know was written there. His eyes flickered with confusion. Then, with something harder, but he did not open it, only stared at the envelope as though it might burn him. I could see the struggle on his face, the tug of loyalty to his wife against the faint memory of loyalty to his mother, and I felt sorrow swell in me even as I stood firm. I wanted to reach for him, to remind him of who I was, but instead, I let the letter speak for me, because it was stronger than anything my voice could say. He left with it still unopened, slipping it into his coat, and when the door closed behind him, I sat down in the chair he had refused to take, knowing that I had not just defended my home, but had drawn the line of my legacy. It did what my silence alone could not. It set fire to the illusions they had built, and soon word reached me that Lena's family was raging, their voices carrying like thunder through phone calls I was not meant to hear, calling me ungrateful, cruel, a woman too stubborn to understand her place, though it was my place that had given them the ground to stand on. Wei did not call, did not come, and the absence of his presence carved itself into me more deeply than their insults ever could, because he was caught in the tangle of shame and anger, ashamed perhaps of how far he had let things go, angry that I had found the strength to stop him, and I felt him pulling away from me as if distance could erase the truth. At night I lay awake and grieved, not just for the fracture in my family, but for the years I had given, believing that sacrifice would be answered with love, only to find that sacrifice had been seen as obligation, invisible once completed. Yet, even as grief pressed heavy on me, I found a small pocket of peace in the community centre, where I sometimes went to help with English classes, a place filled with elders whose faces bore the same lines of endurance as mine. When I shared pieces of my story, hesitating at first, as though speaking aloud might make the wound deeper, I was met, not with judgment, but with nods of recognition, with stories of their own children who had turned away, who had chosen convenience over love, wealth over memory. In that circle, I realized I was not alone, that my pain was a language many mothers knew by heart, and together we stitched our brokenness into something less unbearable. We laughed at small things. We prayed quietly for strength, and in their company, I felt my grief transform, not into joy, but into acceptance, into a steady breath that told me I could still endure. Lena's family could rage, Wei could hide. But within those walls I found a reminder that I was not erased, not yet, that even if my own son no longer saw me, there were others who carried the same scars, and in sharing them, we became visible again. The house is quiet now, but it is a quiet I have made my peace with, a quiet that does not sting like abandonment, but instead settles around me like a blanket, reminding me that these walls still belong to me, that every tile and beam carries the story of how I endured. I walk from room to room slowly, letting my fingers brush against the doorframes, feeling the grooves carved by years of use, and I think of the countless moments that once filled this space, the laughter of a boy playing with toy cars across the floor, the smell of steamed buns cooling on the counter, the sound of rain tapping against windows while I whispered bedtime stories about ancestors and rivers that never ran dry. It is not the life I imagined when I first carried Wei in my arms, believing my sacrifices would tie him to me with gratitude, but it is still my life, unbroken, unsurrendered. On the windowsill, I place a photograph of my mother, the one she gave me before I left Guangdong, her eyes steady and filled with a strength I now finally understand, and I whisper to her in Cantonese that all her suffering was not in vain, that I carried her lessons across an ocean, and though the cost was heavy, the house I protected stands as proof. Neither of us lived only to be forgotten. Wei may never forgive me, may never see my refusal as anything but betrayal. But I know time will one day reveal the truth to my granddaughter, that love is not proven by giving away everything until nothing remains, but by holding firm to what must be preserved so it can be passed on with dignity. Perhaps she will walk these same halls when I am gone, tracing the same doorframes with her fingertips, feeling the history pressed into the wood, and she will know that her grandmother did not bow to convenience or surrender to silence, but chose instead to leave her a legacy untainted by greed. I stand in the center of the living room, the afternoon light spilling through the windows, and I feel the weight of years ease from my shoulders, for I have reclaimed what was almost lost. My story is no longer one of being overlooked, but of refusing to disappear, of finding my voice after a lifetime of silence. And in that voice, I finally hear my own freedom.